Welcome to my mini lecture on the Gilded Age. As I said in one of the other lectures, there were a number of reasons for authors to turn away from Romanticism, turn away from the optimistic ideals and ideas of transcendentalism. One of those had a lot to do with industrialization and what this meant to a lot of people's day-to-day lives. This period, the period following the Civil War, saw a very rapid development of a number of things. All kinds of inventions, machines, and manufacturing. I'll name just a few. It saw the invention of the railroads and the development of the railroads. A lot of agricultural machines were first invented during this period. Steam turbines, gas light, the telephone, refrigeration, very important because it meant that you could transport meat and vegetables over longer distances. That caused the kind of meatpacking industry that was criticized by Upton Sinclair in The Jungle, which I mentioned in another lecture. It saw the invention of streetcars, the typewriter, the phonograph, which, for those of you too young to know, is a record player. So the world became lit up, very noisy, very fast-moving, and cities, industrial cities, grew at a great pace. New York, Chicago, Pittsburgh, they all grew. All of this brought great prosperity for some, and I have a couple of examples for you here. This one, of course, you know, Henry Ford. But what you probably don't know is that he was born on a farm. He started his career as a mechanic. He worked his way up and eventually became an inventor. He is, in a way, the inventor of the assembly line, the conveyor belt along which work can be done. And as a result, he became the largest car manufacturers of his time. He made cars affordable for almost all people. So that was very important. The next one is Thomas Edison. I'm not entirely sure if you've heard of his name. He was an inventor, but he also came from very humble beginnings. He only went to school for 3 months. His teachers thought he had a learning disability and sent him home. But the thing is, he proved to be an entrepreneur from the very beginning. He sold newspapers and candy on trains. He is credited with being the inventor of the phonograph, so the first record player. But perhaps most important, he was the one who first found a way to make light bulbs that could be produced for a reasonable price. So for a price that normal people could pay for that light bulb. The light bulb had been invented, but he made it profitable. So he was the founder. He ended up as being the founder of General Electric. Okay, another famous name, John Rockefeller. What few people know about him is what got him his start. We all know he was incredibly rich, but how did he do it? Well, when he was a boy, he raised turkeys on a spare plot of land to earn a little pocket money. And what made him rich was to invest and reinvest and reinvest. And in the end, he became the founder of Standard Oil. Another name that I'm sure you know, but probably you don't know anything about the man, Andrew Carnegie. That officially is the way one should pronounce this name. He came from very humble beginnings. He was a very poor Scots immigrant who started working in a cotton mill when he was 13. Later, he became a telegraph messenger And somehow he managed to get educated. That's a major feat if you're from a poor background. He became rich in part by investing in the railroads. That was what made him rich. Here, one final name, which you probably only know because of the prize which was named after him, Joseph Pulitzer. Joseph Pulitzer was a very poor immigrant, again, from Hungary, who started his career as a mule tender. Like Carnegie, he somehow managed to educate himself and became a journalist, one of the largest publishers, and a newspaper owner, which is why we have this journalism prize named after him. Now, these kinds of opportunities brought great riches to some. This is visible in the kinds of houses they built for themselves, like the house that Carnegie built for himself. Many of these were on the island of Manhattan, which, as you know, is at the center of New York, and many of them are still or were on the east side of that island, on the east side of Central Park. The following is actually only one of the houses that Cornelius Vanderbilt built for himself. It was demolished. It took up a whole city block. But this was once the largest domestic residence ever built in New York, in the center of New York. You can imagine the kinds of riches necessary for such a house. But very much of this was at the expense of others. And some people were aware of this. For example, a man called Jacob Riis, he was of Danish descent and a journalist and photographer, and he decided to describe the lives of the other half, as he called them, and the misery of the work people had to do to make the kind of riches that we saw earlier possible. In 1890, he wrote or published this book, How the Other Half Lives, and in it he portrayed the conditions under which the people had to live, so-called tenement living. I have a couple of images of that, but I also want to stress that should you ever go to New York, make sure you go to the Tenement Museum, because there you will see some of those apartments, and they are not made pretty, not made prettier than they should be. This is one of Jacob Riis's photographs. The longer you look at the image, the more people you will discover on it. This was how workers who had just immigrated to the United States had to live. Here we have one of such a tenement building. This looks very much like the tenements that you can see in the Tenement Museum. And this is also what that whole area must have looked and felt like at the time. Another apartment, obviously it's in a basement. And here we have another picture of tenement living, which also very clearly shows how many people were crowded into a very small space. This is another one of those pictures where the longer you look at it, the more people you discover. This one I showed earlier. This one was made by Louis Hine. Louis Hine, like Jacob Riis, made photographs to change this situation. He worked very hard to press for legislation against child labor, like this particular child. And on the next two slides, I have two more pictures that he took in order to get this legislation against child labor passed. This is a little newspaper boy. There were texts with all the pictures. If you might notice that he's barefoot. 7-year-old Ferris, tiny newsie, that's how they called these newspaper boys, selling newspapers in the streets, who did not know enough to make change for investigator. In other words, he couldn't do the math to give back the right amount to the investigator for the newspaper that he just bought. Photographs from 1914. At the same time, and this seems contradictory, there was also a new middle class on the rise. And as you can see in this image, they had quite a comfortable life. This looks, I mean, we would not like to live like this, but it looks quite comfortable. As I said in an earlier lecture, we call all of this the Gilded Age, the time of the so-called robber barons, literally the time when actually the game Monopoly was invented. And there was, of course, a good reason to invent it at this time, because that's exactly what people were doing, creating monopolies. But it also created dire poverty, and therefore was criticized very heavily by Mark Twain in a novel that he called The Gilded Age. In this novel, he writes a satire about the greed and corruption involved in this time. He was very critical of the way America had moved from the Golden Age, which he thought of as very idealistic, balanced, where people lived a plain, simple life, but had very high thoughts, so plain living and high thinking, the time in which people were capable of writing things like, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal," to the time in which everything was gilded, so it was just a thin veneer of gold, the time of industrialization, this incredible scramble for wealth and power by people, political corruption, which was also a big problem, and what he called, in order to oppose it to the period before, high living, which is what we call drinking and eating and et cetera, and plain thinking. This concludes this short lecture about the Gilded Age, and I hope you enjoy your readings.